next presenter is David Gray-Hammond. David Gray-Hammond is an autistic mental health and addiction advocate living in Southeast England. He runs the Facebook page and blog Emergent Divergence. He is also the Chief Operating Officer for Neuroclastic and is a presenter for Academy. He has done consultancy work in his home city around the topic of neurodivergent addicts and is currently working on his first book.
Hello. Can I just start by saying how honored I am to be here and to be, invited to join in with this. The presentations that I've seen so far were really wonderful. And thank you so much for having me here.
We will be doing this as an interview. So first, I want to ask you, David, are you late diagnosed?
Yes, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 26 years old, and I'm turning 31 this month. So I was diagnosed 5 years ago.
And when was the first time that you got professional help?
The first time I got professional help was when I was at university. I was referred to a psychiatrist who told me that I had a personality disorder. I had various forms of help throughout my years, but the first time I really got proper help was when I said that I needed help with my addiction, and I was referred to addiction treatment services, and I was referred to another psychiatrist as well. And unfortunately, they wouldn't diagnose me autistic whilst I was using drugs and alcohol, because they believed that autistic people didn't use drugs and alcohol. Eventually, as I got sober, they started to notice that I was autistic, and eventually it was about 7 months after I got sober that I was diagnosed autistic.
Were you aware of your need for help?
Not to begin with. At first, I thought my addiction behaviors were a lifestyle choice. I was in complete denial about the fact that I needed help. But the worse it got, the more I had to recognize that I needed help. I was struggling so much with being an undiagnosed autistic person, and I was self-medicating with anything I could get my hands on. And it took a really long time for things to sink in that I needed help. But eventually I did get that help.
I know the autism diagnosis must have helped you come to terms and make peace with yourself as a person. But how did the diagnosis help you remain sober?
Well, a vital part of maintaining my recovery was to accept that I was autistic, accept my strengths, my struggles, make accommodations for myself, communicate with people what I needed to succeed in this world. And so once I got the autism diagnosis, I suddenly realized I'm not a broken neurotypical, I'm a beautiful autistic person. And once I had that level of self-acceptance and I found the autistic community, it made sobriety a lot easier.
Knowing that you're autistic helped you a lot, but you're saying that being able to advocate for your needs helped you remain sober?
Yes. I couldn't have remained sober without being able to communicate with people the things that I was struggling with and how they could help me to survive those struggles. It was important that I was able to advocate for every aspect of what I needed, and having an autism diagnosis and finding the autistic community and learning more about myself provided me with a means to approach people and say, this is what I need. Can you help me?
um, what was substance abuse a symptom of? So
I
how did it start is really my question.
I always say that substance abuse was a symptom of an unmet need. Um, I started hearing voices when I was 18, and because I'd masked being autistic my whole life, when I started experiencing psychosis, I masked that also. So rather than approaching a doctor for help, I got scared and decided to try and hide it. And so in trying to hide my struggles, I hid in drugs and alcohol.
As they show in movies, substance use is usually motivated by social pressure or peer pressure. And as an autistic person, socialization would have been very difficult for you. So, did substance use, in a way, help you socialize?
Yes, one of the things that I liked about drugs and alcohol was that they took away my social anxiety. It was easier to cope with sensory issues. It was easier to relate to other drug and alcohol users. And it gave me a sense of identity and belonging, albeit a very dangerous identity and belonging.
Tell us a little about how this panned out and what your thoughts were around the time that you started a substance use, and how did it help you?
Well, as I said, when I was 18, I started hearing voices and I started smoking cannabis and drinking alcohol with my friends. Um, at the time, I'd noticed that when I did that, my mental health issues affected me less. And I felt like I belonged to a group of people for the first time in a long time. I moved on to university. I moved 300 miles away and went to university in the north of England. And whilst I was there, I was introduced by new friends to harder drugs. And, my drug use started to increase significantly whilst I was at university. Um, Eventually, I completed my bachelor's degree and I moved back home to the south coast of England. And whilst I was there, my mental health and my struggles from being undiagnosed autistic became too much, and my drug use got completely out of hand. And I was overdosing several times a week. I was dying basically, and at that point I asked for help, and I received it. The problem was that the services that helped me, they didn't know how to treat an autistic person. The services were not designed for autistic people because no one had ever stopped to think that autistic people might also experience addiction. So I had to kind of carve my own path through recovery. And eventually I did find sobriety. And then 7 months later, I was diagnosed as autistic. And I really haven't looked back since then.
Do you think there could be an association or a relationship between the psychosis and the autism?
So my mental health team did tell me that autistic people tend to be more likely to experience conditions like psychosis. I think my psychosis presented very uniquely because I was autistic. So often I was told, you're not typical of psychosis. And my answer to them was, I'm not typical of anything. I'm autistic.
Yeah. Tell me about um, what you think caused the psychosis. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I experienced a great deal of trauma throughout my life, especially in childhood. not just from abuse and things like that, but also, but yeah, it was all abuse actually, because I was abused by the people around me. Society was constantly telling me there was something wrong with me, that I didn't fit in, that I was broken. And I think when you couple that with, I had some really nasty stuff happen to me as a child, it set the stage for me to experience psychosis and addiction.
You're talking about systematic trauma that
Yeah,
played out
systematic trauma.
your whole life. Was the trauma identified?
Well, in the system, I was bullied horrendously for being autistic, and often teachers at school and that would tell me it was my own fault for being different. It was very difficult. My mother did her best to advocate for me, but they didn't really listen to her, and I was bullied by teachers and students alike. And it's like the whole system was set up to grind me down and crush me.
As an advocate now, what trends are you seeing in autistic people around substance use and addiction?
I mean, when I first started advocating for autistic addicts, there was very few people talking about substance use amongst autistic people. But I've been excited that whilst I'm still really the only person I'm aware of who regularly talks about these issues, I am seeing more people appear and say, hey, I've had addiction issues. I've used substances. I drink too much alcohol. And I think it's really good that people are starting to communicate these things with each other and talk about it.
And what do you think are the problems that you're seeing?
The problems with talking about autism and addiction is that a lot of people feel uncomfortable to talk about it. It's a scary topic. It comes with a discussion of horrendous trauma in most cases. And sometimes I think the topic can be too triggering. So people don't want to, mention it for fear of upsetting someone. I think also when we live in a world where the professionals act like addiction doesn't exist amongst the autistic population, it invalidates our experience as autistic addicts.
Yes, because of your work, actually, I have started to notice and started to get educated about this topic. And yeah, I have come to know that a lot of autistic adults use substance, abuse substance, so that they can manage their anxiety, so that they can manage social situations. What do you think of the therapy? You said that professionals are not really ready to acknowledge addiction, and there's very little awareness about addiction in the autistic population. So how does this affect therapy models?
Well, the problem is that therapy models are designed for the dominant neurotype. So in this case, neurotypicals, there's lots of therapies that have been researched for them. But when it comes to autistic people, those same therapies tend to be applied to them, and they're not necessarily as successful because our brain is different. The way we experience the world is different. And I think really that, people working, especially with autistic addicts and autistic people experiencing mental health problems, they need to educate themselves on the autistic experience. And we need to see more research into therapies and how they interact with autistic people.